welcome again. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into some local issues. Obviously, being a podcast called Canadian Founders, we want to talk most about founders and the founder experience in Canada, specifically to Canada. But there's obviously a lot going on around the world, right and wrong. And so we wanted to try and identify some of our opinions on things that are changing and priorities going forward for both for us and for the country as a whole and fellow entrepreneurs. So there were a few questions that I looked at and I wanted us to sort of weigh in on. And it really comes down to, what are we seeing that around the world, both locally and internationally, that is resonating with us either positively or negatively in terms of what we want to emulate locally or what we want to change so that we're essentially course correcting and not following a path that others might be on or going down. What specifically can we influence locally? And I put a challenge out to each of us that, what can we actually individually do on the ground, or what actions are we committing to doing in order to try and affect some of those changes? So I'll jump in first. And the one thing that I guess the overriding thesis that I have is I think and I don't know how we're going to execute on this. I think there needs to be some political champions to really bring this to the fore. But I think we as a country, because we are quite a small population, I do think it's possible for us to have a general dialogue around like, what are the values that we want to pursue going forward? I think what gets lost in the shuffle, especially when we look at the US system, is it's highly partisan. And what we've seen is even legitimately good ideas that have been, let's say, a democratic cause for the last 20 years, the second that the opponent, Republican Party starts acting on it, immediately it becomes a negative because they have to be seen to oppose that opposition. So I think if we, as a country, we kind of try and remove those partisan divides, and we sort of focus on what are the values, what are the priorities we want to pursue, irrespective of which party or which ideology pursues it. And I'll give you one example that's kind of instructed this for me. There's been a lot of discussion, especially around German elections this past weekend, and the German economy has, for all intents and purposes, essentially deindustrializing. And a major cause for that is that their energy costs are significantly higher than they were 5 or 10 years ago, and they're significantly higher than their competitors. And so the statistics that I read was domestic German industry had invested something like 15 billion euros within Germany and close to 120 billion euros outside of Germany. So there's a clear flight of capital. There's a clear focus that if they want to remain competitive, they can't do it at home because their energy costs are simply too high. And if you look at technology, the industry that I'm in, AI and the building blocks of AI, specifically semiconductors and the energy required to power those semiconductors, you really, if you can't afford to power them, or the cost to power those facilities becomes essentially counterintuitive, then you will not have an industry. You'll be relying on someone else to do that. So that's an example of, if we really want to be developing AI, if we want to be a leader in a certain field, and that field is highly energy dependent, we need to get our priorities straight in terms of where is that energy coming from? Are we producing it ourselves? Are we going to import it? And, again, if we're going to import it, what is the security of that supply chain look like, and stuff like that. So I guess any thoughts or comments on that to begin with, and feel free to jump in with anything that you guys are seeing.
Yeah, I think I would like to start looking inward for this conversation before we start looking outward. And I think I like where you started, where you kicked it off, Kyle, in terms of the values that resonate with Canadians. Like, I recently participated in a conversation where we were talking about Canadian prosperity. And, kind of first we need to define what is the Canadian dream. I think we've lost our way a little bit. We were talking in this conversation, a few people in the room were actually immigrants to Canada. And they talked about when they immigrated here 20 years ago, Some 30 years ago, some in the last 10 years, there was this Canadian dream. There was this sense of pride and prosperity in Canada, and I think people are starting to lose sight of that here. So I think the first thing we need to do is we need to find that. We need to define what that is first, and maybe we could do this together collectively, the three of us. What our idea of Canadian prosperity is. We need to define that, and then we need to talk about an action plan on how we can get back there. And a lot of it is people. It's stemmed to the public system, but we're all of us are in the private sector, so we have to talk about strategies that we can deploy from the private sector as business owners, as employers, as employees. What can we do at the local level to work with the public sectors to influence this change that we need? But first, we got to figure out what that change is. So I don't know about you guys, but like some of the values for me, one of the values I'll start off is like affordability and just the cost of living. It's gotten out of control here. And we talked about this on one of the podcasts. I feel that the gap between wages and the cost of living is just spiraling out of control. And most people you talk to are living paycheck to paycheck, just, barely getting by. And these are people that have good jobs, people that have good educations, high paying jobs. They're still struggling to afford housing. They're still struggling to buy groceries, pay their mortgage. So I think that's, for me, that's one. There's many things, but I'm going to start off with that. My thing is, lifestyle, cost of living, and being able to go to work, have a good job, and be able to afford to have a good quality of life.
Yeah, I think that's, and I'll throw in what I think is kind of necessary for us to get back to that. I think there's been a lot of talks about, basically giving support, to people and the public, but there's not much discussion around businesses. I think it all stems from, starting businesses, getting businesses up and running as quickly as possible, and giving these support to these people that are starting businesses and essentially hiring people. Right? And I think there's a large part of that is we got to make sure that we can we can generate enough jobs before we bring in the people. Right? I think we've always been so focused on, our population declining all over the world. We're all focused so much on population decline, but nobody talks about, okay, so now we're going to bring in a massive influx of people, but what jobs do we have for them? Right? What economy do we have for to hire these people? And that leads to like exactly what you've said, Mike, is cost of living. Like there's just, wages are not, inching upward because businesses are suffering. At the end of the day, businesses are not handing out paychecks. We need to generate money. We need to generate revenue in order to pay people. And if we
I
are,
love this point, Andrew, because you know why this is such a good point? Because a lot of people will challenge that and say that's selfish and the government needs to subsidize those and not subsidize businesses that are making money. However, you said the key point right there. Businesses are the ones creating jobs. They're the ones employing these individuals, creating product, GDP. And it's almost like, it's that the analogy I like to use is like on an airplane. When there's an emergency in the airplane, who do you put the mask on first? You put the mask on yourself first so you can help others that are dependent on you. So Business Canada needs to fix its problem and support, like you're saying, entrepreneurs, support businesses, and allow them then to in turn stimulate the economy and job creation. I agree with you. And it's not nothing that it's not selfish. It's actually it's not self-serving. It serves the greater good.
if you think about it, the people that are starting business are taking massive risk. They're putting their family, on the line. They're putting their financials on the line. They're putting everything on the line, and they're putting pressure on all these aspects of their life in order to essentially build a successful company and in turn hire people. How do we hire people if we don't generate money? If we don't get any support? Like I think, like I say this all the time, and I think that the government should be subsidizing businesses for based on the amount of jobs they're creating. Like how many jobs have you created in the past year? Let's talk about that, right? Like
So
that's
I want to take a contrarian perspective to that because one thing that I personally feel is really counterproductive is government, any sort of public sector initiative where the variable or the goal is job creation. Because what we've seen, and I don't know the official stats on this, but I've seen something like 1 in 4 people works for the public sector. Now, in my personal opinion on that is that is removing people from the private sector that would otherwise be generating value and productivity in, businesses, either working for them or themselves. And so, I understand the desire of, government to be seen to be providing jobs for people, but at the end of the day, like, isn't that just glorified welfare? Like,
Well,
if we're just giving people a paycheck so that they don't have to struggle to get a job because we've done other things to essentially suffocate the ability to create those jobs, that's not sustainable. That's not going to go anywhere.
That just further supports the argument, though. That's an indirect way of supporting businesses, is by, thinning out government. Government right now is very big. It's very heavy. It's a big burden on the taxpayers. And quite frankly, it's a big burden on small businesses that are competing with these government bodies for employees. Why would someone want to go work for a small business startup, an entrepreneur like you, Kyle, that has, X amount of employees, that's going to pay X amount of dollars, when they can go to the government that's offering, 50% more salary, full benefits, full pension, job security, no low pressure in some environments.
you can't
There
compete.
goes your workforce.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, we should be incentivizing businesses for and helping them hire people in the private sector, right? Like, I think that,
That creates GDP. The private sector creates GDP.
yeah.
The public sector, I don't want to bash the public sector. It's needed, it's necessary, it still has to be there. I think there just has to be some measures in place with how the funds are being dispersed there, and how heavy some of the resources being deployed there are. But at the end of the day, the government sector is not producing GDP, any product for Canada.
So
Yeah.
what would you want to see the government do? What would you want to see them change?
I think there's a lot of incentives around, like, innovation. There's a lot of incentives, for essentially the government's spending a lot of money in other aspects, supporting people for, with welfare, with all these, needs of the people. But I think, what about the needs of the businesses?
Andrew wants to see the government hire Doge.
So this is what I'm getting at. So this is actually a really interesting correlation, is that, I would actually say that our government has a ton of those types of programs, like, technical modernization, and, like, hire a student and all this sort of stuff. And, I think they mean well. And I think, coming back to this whole, like, what are our values and our priorities? I think a big thing that we need to do as a country is focus on outcomes. I think we're so distracted by a good story and a good narrative as, like, oh, I'm well intentioned. I'd love to, every student that graduates university has a job waiting for them. So we're going to roll out $10 billion to do X, Y, and Z. Well, if that doesn't actually do anything, well, we need to know that, and we need to change it. Right. And I don't think that there's, especially the last 10 years, there hasn't been any, sort of postmortems on some of these programs, and record spending. Like, there's no question we have spent more in the last 10 years than we have in our entire history. So are our outcomes actually better? I would argue, no, they're not. So, we need to be mindful of, let's not lose sight of what we want to do, but what is the best way to achieve that? And I don't think another special interest program, another tax rebate, another this, like a GST holiday for 4 months, I think that made absolutely no difference to business owners, right?
Exactly.
So, like, why do it?
So what approach are you taking, Kyle? Maybe less red tape, less bureaucracy, let businesses just, free enterprise, let them grow, let them just, remove the red tape and the taxes and the bureaucracy. Is that more of your approach?
So I definitely align with that, mindset, in terms of, I think there is a ton of protectionism in Canada. I think we're probably one of the worst countries in the world. It was really actually quite revealing, now that this US tariff conversation has started, how much inter-Canadian trade is prohibited, or how many restrictions there are. So it's actually easier for us to trade with our neighbor than it is for us to trade internally. There's just tons of regulation. There's tons of red tape. And additionally, there's a lot of again, glad handing and pork barreling that goes on in Ottawa, where you're not seeing competition. You're not seeing an open market. You're not allowing people to compete. And as a result, they're just, the winners are getting picked by national interests, and everyone else is kind of wondering what they did wrong. So I honestly think it's going to be harsh to some people. It's very similar to the Doe's perspective of like zero-based budgeting, where it's like, let's just cut everything, and then put back what we actually think we need from a priority and see what the outcomes are, right? Like get rid of all the special spending, get rid of all the special programs, open the market up to foreign competition. And let's be honest, like to your point about affordability, the one thing that drops prices the fastest is competition, right? If you feel like you're paying too much, we saw it in, mobile phone data costs. They started selling spectrum and they prohibited the large incumbents from purchasing it. Monthly charges went down dramatically, right? That's all we need to focus on is increasing competition, increasing market access, simplifying the ability for allowing foreign national companies to compete, period. Like the level of protectionism where we're prohibiting companies from even selling goods and services in Canada to protect our local industry is shocking. I get it. I understand why. But as a result, we've got a monopoly or an oligopoly that's essentially just, pork barreling and, wasting our fees on nothing.
That's true. There is a lot of that happening in Canada, especially you look at like to the telecom, banking. There's only a couple major players in there, and nobody has ever been able to penetrate the market. So that's an interesting point, Kyle.
And when we talk about trade between the provinces, I know there's no tariffs between the provinces, but what I've heard is there's lots of regulation around province to province trade and excise taxes. So yeah, like remember I think it was Alberta, they're exporting more oil to the U.S. than they are to other Canadian provinces. That some stat like that.
Far and away, because we just don't have the infrastructure locally. And that's another, federal national conversation, is to say, if you've got one side of the country that's buying energy and they're buying energy from foreign countries because we do not want to build the infrastructure in order to supply them with homegrown energy, is that positive? It's not positive for the Canadian economy.
No, well, that leads into the prosperity. Like if we start building the infrastructure, we start supplying ourselves, that's Canadian prosperity to me.
Yeah, the question I have is, and this is a question I get all the time, when I talk to investors, is that, they always ask, as a Canadian, are you looking to enter the US market? Everybody asks that question. So to me, it's like, the desire, like I guess, for these investors is for a company from Canada to penetrate the US market because of the size of the market over there. So then going back to this question of building the infrastructure and all that stuff to support sales internally, is there going to be anybody that's going to want to invest into building all of this infrastructure for trades between provinces if the market size is like, a tenth of what the US is? Like, is it gonna, like, who's gonna invest in this? Like, is it the government? Is it external? Is it, like, who's gonna invest in this for a market of this size?
Yeah, so the question I think is a very good one, and I think the answer needs to be the ability to trade locally needs to be easier and more preferable than trading with foreign countries. And to your point, it has, like, there's no question we're going to compete from a gross market size perspective, but it's got to be easier to trade with your neighbor within the same country than it is to trade with another country. And I think that's the thing that we've done really poorly, is that it's been preferential for everyone to find a foreign trading partner, because it's just not, like, again, the juice isn't worth the squeeze trying to go interprovincially. And if we were to correct that, and if we were to make it so that any company in any province would very easily be able to, source materials and sell goods and services across the country, I think that you would see a lot more competition, a lot more interprovincial trade, a lot more innovation. People would be a lot easier starting a company selling 100 kilometers away than, you know, a different country.
So what you guys are saying here is actually making me think of something. We're so focused on how can we influence the public sector, but there's also the mentality of the private sector. Aside from our public sector in Canada and the funding and the taxation, you talked about raising capital, venture funding. When you go to the U.S., the mentality and the mindset is totally different than when you go to Canada. And I've talked to entrepreneurs. We've all dealt with individuals from the US versus Canada, entrepreneurs who've dealt with VC firms there versus VC firms in Canada. Why is it that the mentality in the US is so pro startup? It's all about opportunity. Let's seize the opportunity. Let's take a risk. Let's roll the dice. Let's try to build something great. But in Canada, everyone is so conservative, even on the private sector. You go to look for funding, you look for a loan through a bank, you look for a new supplier. It's so difficult to find people willing to take chances and risks. Is this at the detriment of Canada, how we've become?
Yeah, like, and we're a perfect example. So the vast majority of our connections are with the US investors and clients and everything. And part and parcel of that is, to your point, like, I think it's really fascinating, this conversation about product GDP per capita and productivity. And what we're seeing is the US have, and in comparison to other countries as well, Canada's done very poorly. They're at the bottom of the whatever it is, the IECD or G8, but other countries have not done much better than us. But the US have done extremely well. And one of the things that's interesting about productivity growth is that it's typically tied to investment. So companies in the US are essentially investing in new technologies and new equipment, new capital, where their counterparts in Canada are not. And I think there's no question, you hit the nail on the head to say our populations are highly, highly conservative. We don't take risk. We don't change our bank. We don't change our cell phone provider. We don't, like, it's just not part of our DNA. And I think
we live in the same community our entire lives.
Totally. Right. Like, we're very, very, we love our homeostasis. We don't like change. We don't like moving things. We don't like doing things differently. And we haven't been investing in change. We haven't been investing in new technologies and new productivity. So the question is, like, well, how do we change that? I think part of it, again, I agree with you, it has to be led by the private sector. The private sector has to be the innovator, has to be the early adopter, because government is definitely not going to be that. And so what is the mindset change to encourage business owners that are currently not investing and not spending money to say, hey, it's worth taking that risk? I think that's the thing, is we need to demonstrate, and that, an obvious one is like a case study or something, provide evidence that doing so will make a difference.
We're onto something.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you're saying that, because I see it all the time. Like, I see investors whenever Mike and I, when you and I, we speak to investors, Canadian investors always ask about revenue. Like, what is your revenue? How are you generating revenue? What's your revenue growth? Are you profitable?
Yeah, are you profitable? In your first year, are you profitable?
Yeah, we're just like Exxon. Don't worry.
Yeah, it's a very different conversation when you're dealing with a startup. So and these guys they're calling themselves early stage investors, seed investors, right? And they're asking these questions. So this is leading me to believe, from experience, these are really growth investors, right? Later stage. So they're trying to look for something, like a late stage in an early stage company, which is conservative. You're essentially taking that conservative mindset, conservative investment mindset, and putting it into early stage risk. It doesn't happen. Like, a lot of these startups, they don't generate revenue. They're probably cash flow negative. They're probably burning through capital just to create that product market fit, create that first product, that first MVP, or whatever it is. So, if this is the mindset of investors in Canada, so is that really promoting startups? And if we're not promoting startups, going back to your earlier point, Mike, how is that creating jobs? Right? How are we creating net new jobs for people if the only company that can survive, that can grow in this country, or established company that are coming in from the US? Like, you think about it, these massive companies are moving into the US, buying up local companies, and we see it all the time in our business, buying up local companies and trying to make them more efficient. And what does that do? That creates less jobs, actually, right? It's the startups that needs people, that needs to scale. They'll supplement a lot of the inefficiency with people creating jobs, not the other way around. So
Well,
that's my take on it. I think you're right. You guys discussed both really important points and why we're not seeing job growth in our country, and the investment dollar is not there. There's like, I haven't seen it can investor that came to me and say, hey, I want to invest in Canada. I haven't seen that. Have you guys?
so I was going to ask this. No, I haven't. What's the angel community like in Canada? Maybe that's something that we have to advocate more for, the angel community. And is it alive in Canada? Are people actually members of it? Are they advocating? Because that's something that would start stimulating this growth that we're talking about.
I'm going to
Yeah.
jump in and just say something here. It's I think one thing the U.S. has that's worked out really well for them is Silicon Valley, right? And they produce some of the best companies out of the U.S. like Apple, Facebook, Meta now, yeah, Apple, Google, and all these companies, all these big tech companies are from the U.S., from the Silicon Valley. So all the investors are chasing that. They FOMO at the end of the day. So what FOMO have we created here in Canada? If I ask you, what's the biggest tech name in Canada? How many can you name?
Shopify
So what FOMO is there?
and RIM.
So what FOMO are we creating? So, if there's, after this long period of time, if there's only one unicorn that came out of this place, is it going to really attract investors? Probably not. So that's my take on it. I think you need to create more unicorn, and the goal is to create more unicorn, essentially create as many of these companies as possible to create that FOMO.
Yeah, but
And
these unicorns won't be created without funding, and it's like the chicken and the egg. Yeah, we got to create these unicorns, but how do they do it when they're not starting off with a bag of cash? Like a lot of these companies that you've mentioned got massive funding right at the onset, early stages. So I think we got to build that community. We need that venture angel community. People need to start getting involved. I think, like Kyle said, businesses need to start taking chances and investing in opportunities, investing in emerging technologies, investing in external trade partners or counter like inter-province trading. But I really think that there has to be a stronger sense of community for investors here in Canada. I don't even know what it is at the moment or how to access it. If I was an investor and I wanted to invest in a startup, I wouldn't know where to start.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
So
hard.
it's interesting because, I've been involved in that part of the community years ago. And there's no question there's a very, I would say, vibrant yet niche, angel community. There's a National Angel Investor Association. There's a Canadian Venture Capital Association. Like, there's definitely people that are heavily involved and heavily invested in that part of the economy. But I do think that it's infinitesimally smaller than what we see in the US. And my own experience is definitely that when there's much more capital chasing deals, you tend to see deal flow. You tend to see entrepreneurs and deals getting funded that otherwise wouldn't. And so I think that's one of the reasons in Canada we see very conservative, safe money. One of my favorite examples is what you guys mentioned, Shopify. So Shopify in US standards essentially bootstrapped their success. Like, they raised very, very little. I think the final dollar value was like $2 or $3 million. And to put it in perspective, our national venture investing arm of the federal government invested the year that they went public. So this was a company that had well established itself as a growth story. It had gone through all the trials and tribulations, and I can't speak to what their fundraising strategy was, but I'm sure they found it very difficult, like most in Canada, to raise money. And for them to see interest before they went public from organizations that are, again, federally funded by the taxpayer to incentivize and support very early stage, quote unquote, venture stage companies, tells you all you need to see about the mindset and the level of capital that's available in the system.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Kyle. Like I didn't even know that the government invested that late into Shopify. It's that's interesting.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
just
So like, I don't think it's fair to like, I don't think anyone is vilifying, the early stage investors. I think they're out there and they definitely participate in deals, but I think we need to be a little bit more pragmatic to say like you said, Andrew, like until we have some success stories. I think there's been a lot of people that have also tried, to invest in early stage companies and they've failed, right? And they've been burned by that, and they've said, well, why, if I'm not, you know, wealthy, like Silicon Valley exit type wealthy, if I don't have a couple $1 billion, like, look at all the people that spun out of PayPal, the number of founders, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, there's a huge army of them. Reid Hoffman went on to start LinkedIn. Like they essentially created a ton of value, and they went on to invest that value and found other companies, invest in other companies. And it's just, this cyclical upward trajectory. We simply don't see that. Well, most of the world doesn't see that. Silicon Valley stands alone in that respect. But I think a big part of that is that we don't have the capital because we don't have the deals, and we don't have the deals because we don't have the capital. And I've seen, provincial initiatives and federal initiatives to try and support incubation, but I think there's still leaves a lot to be desired. And I don't think it's necessarily what the average taxpayer would like to see their tax dollars going towards. I think, there's a lot of different strategies. I don't know what the right one is.
Yeah. That is a tough one to kind of figure out, that winning strategy for ramping up investment in startups, and more startups, more creation, more risk. I don't know if we're
I
gonna
would
answer that in
go
the
like
podcast.
it's interesting that you like I go on Angel List, I go on all these like like places, and I rarely see Canadian startups as tech startup. There's just, first of all, talent's another problem. We're competing with the U.S. for talent, right?
Yeah, but think about how many startups in the US, successful startups, were actually founded or run by Canadians. Like technically Elon is, partially Canadian. He immigrated from Canada to the US. Slack was created by a Canadian founder out of Vancouver. Uber, one of the founders was Canadian out of Calgary. Like Waterloo produces tons of world-class engineers, most of which actually find jobs in the US because of these large tech companies. So I think we just don't offer enough opportunity. Again, we don't have the businesses. Why don't we keep our people? Because we don't have the companies. Why don't we have the companies? Because we don't keep our people. And so, like what are the, boots on the ground changes that we can make as, again, private entrepreneurs, as private founders here, to be able to try and affect some of that change?
Yeah, exactly. I think we have to figure out a way to retain and keep the talent that we have. We have a lot of brain here in Canada, but we need to make sure we keep them. And like you said, Kyle, like all these great minds, like that have started great companies, multi-billion-dollar companies, have left. So I think it's a big part of trying to keep these individuals and creating that environment for them to grow in Canada.
Brain drain has been an issue that Canada's faced for quite some time. More prevalent recently, this brain drain. It's not just business owners, but even professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, like high caliber professionals are leaving to the U.S. for greater opportunity. So you're right. This comes back down to that question, like, how do we create that prosperity here? Why would a lawyer, or a doctor or an entrepreneur stay in Canada and work here or open up their practice here? Like that's what we need to get back to, and that's the $1 million question, really.
And I'm going to throw out this question.
I don't know how to answer it.
I'm going to throw this question. I think we talk about tariffs and all this stuff a lot, and I think the Bank of Canada's method to counter all of this is to lower interest rate to make our dollar more competitive. Now, making our dollar more competitive, what does that mean? That means the US dollar is going to become a lot more attractive. So does that mean we're going to increase more brain drain?
100%. If I can go in the US and make 50% more just on the currency exchange rate. Yeah, and the
So,
cost of living is lower there too, depending on where you go. So now my dollar is going so much further because I'm gaining on the currency and I'm gaining on the cost of living. Many states is which is much lower than some of our main cities here in Canada. You know, the main cities being, you know, Vancouver, Toronto, Calgary. They're getting very costly.
so if that's the
It's
case,
gonna get worse.
we're losing talents already at a crazy pace. So that means this is going to cause us to lose even more talent.
Yeah, but I think those are, again, I think those are challenges for the public sector because, you know, Mike hit the nail on the head when he talked about affordability. You know, that's not something that we can control, but it's having a material impact on the people that are staying and the people that are going, right? Like if you're a young professional and you can't afford to purchase a home in Canada, but you can't afford to purchase a home somewhere in the US and you're given an opportunity to work there, like there's no contest, right? Like we as Canadians or as a country need to provide a compelling, you know, reason, a compelling offer for people to stay and work here. It's the same thing that my province of Alberta has struggled with in the last 10 years when it comes to foreign direct investment in energy. You know, energy has been a bad word, especially across Canada. And as a result, the things that people want to build and things that, you know, the investments that people want to make, the capital is going somewhere else. You know, foreign investors that are saying, hey, I could invest my money in Alberta, you know what, there's too much regulatory uncertainty, there's too much interference from federal or provincial politics, it's just not worth the risk. I'm not going to get the return. I don't have, you know, the you know, foreseeability that my investment is going to go somewhere, so we're going to go somewhere else. And that capital flight, you know, less jobs, less investment, less opportunity. It's meaningful. And I do think that obviously that's a major, you know, the federal government has a major part to play. But I think we as businesses need to be a bit more vocal about what are the drivers for that investment. You know, how do we, in order for us to get access to capital, we need access to opportunity, and we need to show ourselves as being competitive and successful so that we can go to toe to toe with a startup in Silicon Valley. You know, what's the difference there? If it's, you know, if we can show ourselves to be scrappy and doing the same, if not a little bit less, with significantly less capital and significantly less resources, there's no reason that an investor wouldn't, be motivated to try and take a go. So yeah, I think, you know, what's within our control and what should those priorities be?
Yeah, well, we're definitely feeling the pressure from the system being overburdened in terms of, you know, like you said, number one, number one's the deficit. Like the Canadian deficit's gotten out of control, so we're going to feel the pressure of that. You know, Canada's burning through money. They're printing money that's affecting inflation. It's also, the other thing is the regulation, over governance. Over governance in Canada, there's so much bureaucracy, so much red tape, and so many, so much, I hate to say it, but fat that should be trimmed. So that's gonna translate. That's pressure that's gonna trickle down. So that pressure is trickling down to entrepreneurs because they're not getting the support they need, or they don't have the means to succeed. I think that number one, entrepreneurs should be speaking to their local MPs at a local level. You know, MPs don't have a lot of say, but if you're at least getting in their ear, you should be meeting with the MPs on a regular basis. Have a relationship with someone in Parliament so they can at least bring up these concerns at the higher level. So that's number one. And number two, in terms of what you were saying, Kyle, why are people, like, if we need to compete with the US, and how people are leaving because they can get more money. You know, it all comes down to money. They can live, and it's not just making money, it's also like having disposable income. So that's the cost of living too, because, just at the end of the day, it's my disposable income. The person's like, how much am I left with in my pocket at the end of the month? I don't care what I make, what I spend. What's left over for me at the end of the month?
So I think
I can make
that's an
300,000
important
here, but if I spend 400,000, what good is that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, though. So, like, we could essentially effectively double our income if we reduced our cost of living by half, right? So if we essentially provided, effective subsidized healthcare, relatively low tax, low cost of living, affordable housing, affordable food, we would be competitive by virtue of the fact that our income would provide a lot more than competing jurisdictions. And so I agree that, like, it's wonderful to make more top line revenue and make more income, but what is it costing us, right? Like purchasing power parity, look at how much inflation has destroyed and the value of our dollar has destroyed our purchasing power. So, I think those are, it's again, like what's actually going to matter to people. And I do agree that we could have some very relatively quick and easy wins if we just said, hey, let's focus on cost of living. Let's focus on affordability, and let's focus on actually giving people a really clear alternative to just going overseas and making a ton of money.
I agree. And it affects all of us in this podcast here. We're employing these individuals, and these individuals have such a high cost of living. We're seeing them come out of school with these crazy requests for salaries or no experience, and they make these exuberant salary requests, but they're justified in the cost of living. They're not justified in the skills trade. So they're coming with no experience and expecting so much. So we're not trading dollar for, input of service or output of service. But what we are subsidizing is this ridiculous cost of living. So that's why we're subsidizing that as business owners. We have to pay for that, and that's coming off our bottom line. And then that in turn, it's just like it's a flywheel, the flywheel, Andrew. So that comes off the business's bottom line. And now these businesses don't have the capital to invest in these new technologies, to invest in other businesses, to hire more staff, to create jobs, to expand. It's a cyclical effect.
Yeah, and I think it's going to that kind of reminds me of the minimum wage in Canada, right? Like we pay a very high minimum wage here, and that essentially a mandate that comes down from the government. And the higher the minimum wage, the higher the cost. So now, as a business, you start to think like, if you start to think carefully about hiring someone. Whereas, hey, you know what? If this is the cost, it was lower before, you can experiment. You can hire someone, give them an opportunity. Like it's easier to give someone an opportunity if the cost is not significant enough that it'll make a dent on your bottom line. So to me, it's like these minimum wage and the way the government's controlling this is causing cost of living to go up. Think about it. This cost is being passed down to the consumer, right? And that's what's happening, and it's just a cycle, like you're saying, Mike. It's just like a cycle. We're constantly under pressure to generate more revenue, and pay more, and it's just a cycle.
Yep. And that in turn causes them to pay more for groceries, pay more for services, pay more at the pumps, all these things. So I think that we should start. My opinion is start there. Like you said, Kyle, let's tackle the low-hanging fruit. Well, it's easier said than done, but I think we have to start there.
So bringing it back to what's in our control, what are some things, or like, let's say one thing each that we're focused on doing to try and spur that change. So one of the things that I thought about, there were a few things that I, would commit to doing, but I think an active one is educating myself on what's available that's locally, essentially. I'm not one of these that's like buy Canada for the sake of like making sure that it's Canadian. If it's an inferior product, then I'm not advocating that people change their lifestyles for the worse just to support Canadians. But I do think it's important that I, for example, bank with a traditional bulge bracket bank, and I definitely could do make a lot of changes to better educate myself on what new options there are to support smaller size companies or founding entrepreneurial stage companies, to direct my spending to those areas where you're essentially rewarding innovation with your dollars, rather than, well, I've been doing this for 30 years. It's what my parents did. It's what all my neighbors do. I don't really feel like changing it because it's comfortable. I think we really, I'm going to try and push myself out of my comfort zone and do the research to figure out what I can change to really try and support those, again, that business community with my own dollars.
I like that. Yeah, I think that's for sure. That's something that's definitely within everybody's control. My thing is, I'm just going to mention it again. And I'm still working on this strategy. I'm actually going to be reaching out to the local MPP here in my area, and I'm going to be talking to them about some of these issues. But if you would imagine, one person, it doesn't really make a difference. But imagine now there's 20, 30, 100, 200, 500, thousands of people talking to their local constituents and explaining that, we need to find ways to bring cost of living down. I personally think it's, we could start with some government policies in terms of, where they're deploying their resources. That can help. I'm sure there's a lot of, like you said, inefficiencies where government's deploying resources where they're not seeing the results. It's not like an outcome driven investment. So maybe we could talk with MPs to find out where money's being spent in your local, at the municipal level, at the provincial level. What are the return? Like what are we seeing on this return of investment from the government? And maybe we could start to pressure them to make more sound financial decisions, run it like a business. It's not a charity. The government's not a charity. The government needs to operate closer to a business and turn a profit. There has to be some kind of return, not necessarily a profit, but what is the outcome? What is the return of this investment that you're making, which is essentially, the taxpayers' dollars.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the focus should be on the outcome. It doesn't need to be profitable in the sense of generating cash, but like what are people actually getting, and is it what they want? And if it's not,
what the hell, like the outcome, we need to start tracking, measuring healthcare, the outcome of healthcare. So how much money are we spending on healthcare? How is it being utilized? What are the results? What are the outcomes? What's the average wait time? What's the average outcome? Whatever those KPIs are, I don't know. I'm not a healthcare practitioner, but let's look at the KPIs. And like a business, let's look at these key performance indicators that indicate the health of this industry and how it's performing and what we can do to improve that. Maybe it will require a little bit of additional spending, but with additional spending, we can get an incremental increase in output. I don't know. I just think there needs to be better decisions made, and individuals need to pressure governing bodies to make those better decisions and hold them accountable. That's another thing. Where is the accountability? When you go into politics, all of a sudden there's no accountability. You run your campaign on promising to deliver all these things, and then you get into office, you have your 4-year term, and you can do whatever the hell you want. Where is the accountability? You said you were going to do this. You haven't done it. So let's check back in now. It's like a business. If someone tells you they're going to do something, Kyle, and they don't do it, what happens?
You don't deal with them again.
Right, Andrew?
Exactly. Yeah, I think you're right. Like accountability is very important. It's one of those things that we should hold our politicians, our leadership accountable. It's a business. I agree with you. It's a very poorly run business. My take is I think the important thing is for us to really look into other countries and some of the more successful companies. You look at Singapore, you look at Switzerland, you look at some of these countries that are very wealthy. And I think, why we're not wealthy? Why is it that we are falling behind? Like we're a great nation. Like Canada's a great country to be in. And it kind of makes me think we should be looking at our taxation. We should look at where are we taxing our people? Where are we generating the revenue? Are there certain areas are we overtaxing certain areas that are not stimulating the economy? Cut the taxes in areas that are not stimulating the economy. Axe those taxes. I'm going to use Pierre line here. Axe the tax, and the carbon tax is definitely one of them. Really has an impact on our economy, right? And instead, focus your tax effort on other areas that are that make sense. Like you look at Hong Kong, for example. They have a crazy amount of taxes on property. So you know what? The government has incentive to drive up property values, in order to tax more. Investors are making money; they don't mind paying the taxes. You don't mind paying taxes if they're making money. So I think you really have to look at that. Like our country, like Canada, we need to look into our taxes and cut taxes where it would have the big impact on our economy, and then increase taxes in areas that would generate the most revenue, like a business, right?
The deficit is in the neighborhood of $14 billion right now. So if you divide that by, our population, what is it, 38 million now?
Which deficit? Sorry, because the federal one is way more than that. It's like 60. This annual deficit this year is like 60 billion, isn't it?
Is it?
Yeah.
I got to fact check my facts.
Interesting.
So what is the debt clock at here? Let's have a look. So total federal debt is at 1.2 trillion. So that's 30,000 per Canadian. It grows 110 billion per day. Sorry, 110 million per day.
Oh my goodness.
And what's the annual deficit here?
The number I was looking at was one fiscal year. It wasn't a cumulative. That was the deficit for just 1 year, 14 billion, not the
Yeah, so
cumulative.
this year's fiscal deficit is going to be 61.9 billion. So we're spending $62 billion more than we're making. And the question again on outcomes is, where is that money going? Is it actually going to be invested in something that's going to grow in return? I would guess not. Like if you look at, granted he's on his way out of office, but some of the pet projects that Trudeau has announced, like this $4 billion contract with SNC-Lavalin to design, not to build, to design a train that essentially will save people from flying. 45-minute flight turns into a 3-hour train ride. But anyways, like again, is that going to grow the economy? I would argue it's not. But
Yeah, that was
interesting point, Kyle. 45-minute flight versus a 3-hour train ride. Interesting.
And they're going to spend X amount of billions of dollars on it.
That's a design, right? That's just to look at it, 4 billion. Anyway, so I think again, what are we trying to do? What are the values? What are the outcomes? And I think we need to bring some sanity back. And again, I think from a Canadian values perspective, it comes back to that like risk aversion. Like see no evil, hear no evil. Like we just don't really want to get involved. We don't really want to care. And I think people are starting to wake up, especially the younger generation, because they're like, there's nothing here for me if we're not competitive. If I can't afford a home, if I can't live this quality of life that I want, I'm not going to stay. So that's a big issue. So.
No, you're right. You're right. The see no evil, hear no evil is very apparent here in Canada. It's a Canadian thing to do, even during COVID, when there was all those mandates. Some of them obviously for protection, but they were never called into question. The only time they got called into question, I think, was that truckers rally. But aside from that, Canadians do not want to face adversion for the most part. It's easier to just walk away instead of, take the high road or take the battle. So I think we need to see more of that. We need to all start taking some positive action rather than just turning a blind eye. It's the easy thing to do. Is the Canadian, polite thing to do. I'm going to turn a blind eye to this. We need to speak up. Everyone needs to speak up, and we need to start demanding results of our leadership and voting with our dollars, like you said, Kyle. Let's vote with our dollars and put our personal money to the areas that we're going to see growth in and return.
Love it. Let's leave it there. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next episode. Thanks all.